Okay, let's unpack this. Think for a moment about the last decision you made, maybe even a small one. Did you really have a choice? Or was that decision, in some fundamental way already set in motion?
Right.
That feeling of being in control, the captain of your own ship, is it the real deal or maybe just a sophisticated illusion?
What's fascinating here, I think, is that this very question, the nature of free will, it's echoed through human thought for, well, millennia.
Yeah, ages.
It touches the core of who we believe ourselves to be, and it underpins how we structure our societies, from personal relationships right up to our legal systems.
Exactly, and that's precisely the territory we're exploring today. We're taking a deep dive into this enduring mystery of free will.
And we're guided by a really comprehensive source, an AI perspective on free will, cross-disciplinary synthesis.
Yeah, this source is pretty remarkable because it brings together perspectives from just so many different fields.
It really does. Philosophy, neuroscience, physics, biology, ethics, even law and history. It's like getting a complete map of this incredibly complex topic.
So our mission on this deep dive is to navigate this complexity together.
Yeah.
We want to understand the major points of contention, explore the different ways thinkers have approached this.
And ultimately get a clearer picture of what it all means for you in your day-to-day life.
Right. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to getting a solid grasp on a question that's both deeply personal and, well, universally debated.
And as we get into this, it's important to acknowledge that the free will debate can feel overwhelming.
Definitely.
There are a lot of intricate arguments, specialized language. Our aim is really to illuminate the key insights, make these complex ideas accessible without getting lost in unnecessary jargon.
So let's start with the basics. When we talk about free will, what exactly are we talking about? It feels like it's about having options, right? Like choosing.
Well, that's the initial intuitive grasp, the ability to choose one path when multiple seem available.
Yep.
But as the source points out, even a simple organism like a bacterium can sort of choose to move towards food.
Yeah.
We typically reserve the kind of free will that carries moral weight for something more than that.
Right. So it's not just about selecting from a menu of actions. What's the crucial difference then?
The source highlights the critical aspect of control and self-agency, that sense of being the initiator, the director of your own actions.
Yeah.
The ancient Stoic philosopher Chrysippus put it nicely, saying actions are up to us if they originate through us, meaning from our own judgments and choices. It's about feeling like you are the one in the driver's seat.
Okay, so it's about me being the cause, not just like a channel. But even then, sometimes I act without really thinking, like reaching for a snack when I'm bored. Is that free will?
That brings in the element of rational deliberation. The kind of free will we're really interested in often involves our capacity to consider reasons, weigh consequences,
Right.
and even align our actions with our broader sense of self, the kind of person we believe we are or want to be.
Right.
Impulsive actions, while choices of a sort, often lack that deeper reflective process.
That makes sense. It's not just the action itself, but the mental gears turning behind it. Now, the source also distinguishes between freedom of action and freedom of the will. Can you explain that?
Sure. Think of freedom of action, what Hume called liberty of spontaneity, as basically the ability to do what you want without external obstacles.
Like nothing stopping me physically.
Exactly. If you decide to stand up and nothing's physically restraining you, you have freedom of action. Freedom of the will goes deeper. It probes the source of that wanting, the process by which you form the intention or make the choice itself.
So freedom of action is about whether I can do something, and freedom of the will is about why I chose to want to do it in the first place.
Precisely. And historically, the term liberum arbitrium, often translated as free will, really focused on this idea that our willing isn't necessitated.
Not forced.
Right. That our choices aren't intrinsically fixed or predetermined. Think of it as that core feeling that your decision to, say, listen to this deep dive wasn't forced upon you by some external law or prior event.
Okay, we're building a more layered understanding here. What are the key components that seem essential to this idea of free will, according to the source?
Well, it points to several crucial elements. First, consciousness. Intuitively and philosophically, we link free will to our awareness of making a decision.
Yeah, seems obvious.
Actions stemming from unconscious motives feel less free,
Yeah.
Interestingly, neuroscience even distinguishes between the feeling of willing an action and the feeling of self-agency after the action has occurred.
Interesting. So the sensation that I made a choice isn't necessarily proof that I was the ultimate uncaused cause.
That's a really vital distinction. The second component is moral responsibility.
Ah, the big one.
Free will is almost universally tied to the idea that we can be held accountable for what we do, that we deserve praise or blame. If our actions aren't freely chosen, the very foundation of this accountability seems, well, shaky.
Right. If I'm not truly in control, why should I be held responsible for something I was destined to do anyway?
Exactly. And the third key component mentioned is reason's responsiveness.
Meaning?
Free actions are often seen as those guided by rational thought. We act for reasons we understand and endorse, rather than simply acting randomly or being compelled by forces we can't control.
So to recap, free will involves more than just making a choice. It includes a sense of control, being the agent, often involves rational thought, and is closely tied to awareness, moral accountability, and acting based on reasons.
That sums it up well.
But the source also highlighted some fundamental tensions at the heart of this debate.
Yes. Firstly, there's no single, universally agreed upon definition of free will. Different philosophical schools emphasize different aspects.
Yeah.
Hume, focusing on acting according to your desires. Libertarians on the genuine possibility of doing otherwise. Modern compatibilists on those psychological capacities we just discussed. It's like everyone's circling the same idea but describing it in slightly different terms.
Like looking at it from different angles?
Precisely. And secondly, there's this fundamental tension between our powerful, intuitive feeling of freedom
Yeah, it feels real.
and the much stricter demands of philosophical and scientific scrutiny. Philosophy lays out all these intricate conditions, while science, particularly neuroscience, raises questions about the timing and causal role of our conscious intentions. It makes you wonder if our gut feeling of being free is accurately reflecting the underlying reality.
Okay, so we've explored what we mean by free will, sort of. Now let's step into what the source calls the philosophical battlefield. The big conflict seems to be between free will and determinism. What exactly is this determinism that keeps coming up?
At its core, causal determinism is the idea that every single event, without exception, is necessitated by prior events and the unbending laws of nature.
Every single one.
Yep. Think of it like a vast chain reaction stretching all the way back to the very beginning. If you knew the exact state of the universe at any given moment and all the physical laws, then everything that would happen after that point would, in principle, be perfectly predictable.
So even my seemingly small decision to take a sip of coffee just now was already determined by what happened a moment ago and the day before that and so on all the way back.
That's the implication of strict causal determinism, yes. Physical determinism specifically applies this to the physical world.
Okay.
And the concept of causal closure suggests that the physical events only have physical causes, potentially leaving no room for, say, a non-physical mind to intervene and alter the chain of events.
Like Spinoza's view.
Exactly. Spinoza famously viewed the entire universe as one unbroken sequence of cause and effect.
That sounds like a pretty inescapable system. Where does our free will fit into that picture? Or does it?
That's the central challenge. The consequence argument essentially states that since we have no control over the distant past or the fundamental laws of nature,
Right. Can't change those.
and since those things ultimately determine our present actions, according to determinism, then we don't really have genuine control over our present actions either. It strikes right at the heart of the idea that we are the ultimate authors of our choices. This isn't a new worry. Even the ancient Stoics grappled with similar ideas about fate.
Okay, so if determinism is true, freedom seems to be in serious trouble. Now, the source talks about incompatibilists. Who are they in this debate?
Incompatibilists are those who believe that free will and determinism are fundamentally incompatible. They just cannot both be true.
Can't have both.
Right. And this leads to two main camps with distinct responses.
Let's start with the first one. Metaphysical libertarianism. That sounds like it champions freedom above all else.
It does, yeah. Libertarians are incompatibilists who argue, essentially, we definitely have free will, therefore determinism must be false. They believe that when we make a truly free choice, we genuinely could have chosen differently, even given the exact same past leading up to that moment.
The exact same past.
Yes. So libertarianism hinges on this pretty radical idea that at a crucial moment of decision, you genuinely had two completely different futures available, a concept that seems to clash with strict cause and effect.
So they're saying at the moment I decide to listen to this, I could have, with the exact same thoughts and circumstances leading up to it, just chosen to do something else entirely, like zap, different path.
Exactly. They often talk about the ability to do otherwise, a genuine fork in the road of possibilities. Some propose agent causation, where the agent itself, the person, has this special power to initiate new causal chains that aren't fully determined by prior events.
A kind of causal power outside the normal chain?
Sort of. Others explore non-causal theories, suggesting maybe some free actions aren't caused at all in the traditional sense.
That sounds a bit mysterious. How can an uncaused action still be my action and not just, like, a random blip?
That's the major hurdle for libertarianism.
Yeah, that's the big challenge. How do you explain choices that aren't causally determined but are still under the agent's control?
Right.
Randomness seems just as problematic for responsibility as determinism is. If it's just random, how is it my choice? Libertarians often struggle to provide a clear and convincing mechanism that avoids both strict causal necessity and sheer chance.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a tricky balancing act. So, if libertarians say free will exists and therefore determinism is false, what's the other side of the incompatibilist coin?
That's where we encounter hard determinism, sometimes also called hard incompatibilism or free will skepticism.
Okay.
They agree that free will and determinism cannot coexist. But they conclude that determinism, or something very close to it, given our biology and physics as we understand them, is likely true. And therefore free will, at least as libertarians define it with that could-have-done-otherwise condition, doesn't exist.
So no real choice then. Not in that strong alternative possibility sense. Some hard incompatibilists even argue that free will is impossible, even if the universe isn't strictly deterministic.
Why is that?
Because, as we just discussed, randomness wouldn't give us the kind of control needed for genuine freedom either. Randomness isn't control.
So in their view, we're essentially complex biological machines just going through predetermined motions.
In essence, yes. And the implications for moral responsibility are profound.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
If we don't have free will in this robust sense, can we truly be held accountable for our actions in the way we traditionally think? Thinkers like Robert Sapolsky, mentioned in the source, argue this understanding should lead to radical changes in our society, especially how we approach punishment. Moving away from retribution.
Towards what?
Towards maybe focusing more on prevention, rehabilitation, managing behavior, rather than assigning blame based on a freedom they argue doesn't exist.
That's a pretty significant shift in perspective. Now, the source also discusses compatibilists. They sound like they're trying to find a middle ground, maybe.
You could see them as the bridge builders, yeah.
Yeah.
Compatibilists believe that free will and determinism can actually coexist.
Really? How?
They argue that the truth of determinism doesn't necessarily mean that free will is an illusion. And since most people feel some form of free will is essential for moral responsibility,
Right.
compatibilism often argues that responsibility is also compatible with a deterministic world. It's arguably the most widely held view among contemporary philosophers.
Okay.
Compatibilists essentially redefine free, not as the ability to have done otherwise in the exact same circumstances, but perhaps as acting in accordance with your authentic self, your values, your reasons. Even if that self and those reasons are ultimately a product of prior causes.
Okay, so how do they reconcile these seemingly opposing ideas in determinism and freedom?
Well, classical compatibilists like Hobbes and Hume focused on that freedom of action we talked about earlier.
The no external constraints idea.
Exactly. The ability to act according to your desires without external constraints or coercion. They argued that freedom isn't the opposite of causation. Determinism is the opposite of compulsion or constraint.
Okay.
Hume even famously suggested that a certain kind of necessity, the kind that links our actions reliably to our character and desires, is actually required for responsibility.
Required. How so?
Well, if our actions were purely random, disconnected from who we are, how could we be held accountable for them? They wouldn't reflect our character.
Ah, I see. So as long as my desire to learn about free will came from within me, from my character, and no one forced me to listen, then it was a free action, even if that desire itself was ultimately caused by a long chain of events.
That's the core of the classical compatibilist idea, yes. Contemporary compatibilists often build on this, focusing more on specific psychological capacities.
Like what?
Like the ability to deliberate rationally, respond to reasons, act on values you consciously endorse, exercise self-control. The emphasis shifts from that strong ability to do otherwise, in a metaphysical sense, to being the source of your actions in the right kind of way, even if those actions are ultimately determined.
Being the source.
Yeah. If an action flows from your authentic self, your considered values, your reasoning processes, it can be considered free in this compatibilist sense.
Like a complex computer program, its output is determined by its code, but we still say the program is the source of the result.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Compatibilists apply a similar idea to human actions stemming from our character and deliberation.
But doesn't that feel like a bit of a compromise, maybe a watered-down version of freedom? If my authentic self and my reasoning are themselves determined, am I really free in the deep sense I feel I am?
That's a persistent point of contention, absolutely. That's the main critique from the incompatibilists.
Right.
They argue that compatibilist freedom doesn't capture that intuitive sense of genuine openness, that feeling that we could have truly chosen differently in the exact same situation.
It doesn't feel like a forking path.
Exactly. They also question whether this kind of internally caused behavior in, say, complex machines or even some animals really counts as the kind of free will we associate with moral responsibility. Does being caused by internal factors automatically make it free and morally significant in the way we usually mean?
It seems like the crux of the debate boils down to what kind of control is actually necessary. Necessary for free will, and maybe more importantly, for holding people morally responsible.
Precisely. The source draws a helpful distinction here between leeway and sourcehood.
Leeway and sourcehood. Okay.
Leeway emphasizes that garden of forking paths idea, genuine alternative possibilities open to us at the moment of decision. They could have done otherwise.
That's the libertarian focus.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Sourcehood, on the other hand, focuses on whether the agent is the true origin or source of their actions, in the right way, regardless of whether they strictly could have done otherwise.
So the action comes from me, from my character and deliberation.
Right. Many contemporary compatibilists emphasize sourcehood, arguing that being the appropriate source of a determined action is sufficient for freedom and responsibility. Accepting compatibilism often requires letting go of that strong, intuitive feeling of multiple available futures in any given moment.
A conceptual shift.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The whole debate, at its heart, seems driven by this deep-seated need to ground our moral evaluations, our practices of praise and blame, holding each other accountable. Each position offers a different account of what constitutes sufficient control for that.
Okay, that gives us a solid overview of the philosophical battlefield. Now, the source takes us through the history of this debate. This hasn't just popped up recently, has it?
Oh, absolutely not. No way. The seeds of this discussion were sown way back in ancient Greek philosophy.
Like Aristotle.
Exactly. Aristotle provided a really detailed analysis of voluntary action, deliberation, and choice, laying foundational concepts for later thinkers.
And the Stoics, they believed in determinism, right? How did they handle responsibility?
Right, they had this strong belief in a deterministic cosmos, fate, essentially. They grappled with reconciling this with human responsibility. They ultimately emphasized the role of our internal character and our assent to events. So even if external events are fated, how we internally judge and respond to them is still up to us, our inner reaction.
So even if things are destined to happen, my inner reaction, my judgment, is still my own. That's where the responsibility lies.
That's the essence of the Stoic perspective, yeah.
Yeah.
And then in contrast, you had the Epicureans.
What was their take?
They were also ancient materialists, but they introduced this somewhat radical idea of a random swerve in the paths of atoms' declinament.
A swerve. Why?
Specifically to introduce an element of unpredictability into the otherwise determined atomic motions, and thus allow for human freedom. A literal bit of randomness at the smallest scale to make room for choice.
That's a fascinating idea, almost like a precursor to quantum ideas in a way. What about the influence of religious thought on this debate? Seems huge.
Immense. The concept of liberum arbitrium, the free will of the individual, became absolutely central in Christian philosophy.
Augustine, for example.
Right. Augustine wrestled intensely with the problem of free will, especially in relation to the origin of evil and the absolute sovereignty of God.
The problem, evil.
He argued that evil stems from our misuse of the free will God gave us, but also believed that the human will became corrupted after the fall and now requires divine grace for true freedom to choose the good.
And then there's the classic puzzle. If God knows everything that will happen, including every choice I will ever make, how can those choices truly be free? It seems like they're already fixed if God knows them.
Exactly. That's the theological problem of divine foreknowledge versus free will. It's been debated for centuries.
Any solutions proposed?
Various ones, yeah. Some argue that future contingent events don't yet have a fixed truth value, so God can't know them as fixed facts. Others suggest God exists outside of the linear flow of time, seeing everything at once.
Like watching a movie.
Sort of. Or that God's foreknowledge doesn't actually cause your actions, it just reflects what you will freely choose. God sees the movie of your life, but isn't dictating the script moment by moment.
So the belief in free will has been crucial in theological discussions, particularly maybe in explaining why a good God would allow evil and suffering to exist. Theodicy.
Precisely. It's central to many attempts to reconcile God's goodness with the reality of evil. And related discussions about the nature of God's own freedom, if God necessarily chooses the good, is that still freedom? Also emerged, maybe offering early support for compatibilist-like ideas.
Moving into more modern philosophical periods, how did the Enlightenment era shape the conversation?
Well, the Enlightenment saw thinkers like Hobbes and Hume, as we mentioned, championing classical compatibilism, defining freedom as the absence of external impediments.
Which fit well with science.
Exactly. It aligned well with the emerging scientific worldview of natural laws. Then you had Kant, who introduced a much more complex picture with his transcendental idealism. He suggested we exist simultaneously as determined beings in the observable world of phenomena, governed by cause and effect.
Okay.
But also as free, rational agents in a non-empirical realm, the noumenal realm, outside of space and time, which is the source of morality.
Wow. Two worlds at once.
Kind of. And then William James, much later, even argued for believing in free will on pragmatic grounds.
Pragmatic?
Meaning, believe it, because believing it has positive consequences for our lives, for morality, for effort, regardless of whether we can definitively prove it metaphysically.
It sounds like this debate has been a constant back and forth, with each era building on and reacting to the ideas of the past, often influenced by the prevailing scientific and religious views of the time.
Absolutely.
The source also briefly touches on whether the concept of free will is universal across cultures. Is it?
Well, that's complex. While the specific philosophical arguments we've been discussing are largely Western in origin, the underlying human experience of making choices and feeling a sense of agency seems to be pretty widespread.
People feel like they choose things everywhere.
Generally, people operate in their daily lives as if they and others have some degree of control. However, the way free will is interpreted, its relative importance compared to, say, fate or social obligation, and the specific concepts used, that can vary significantly across cultures.
Like individual versus collective.
Right. Some cultures might emphasize collective responsibility much more than individual autonomy. And furthermore, the development of capacities we link to free will, like self-control or rational deliberation, unfolds over a lifespan and is definitely influenced by cultural norms and practices.
So the experience might be common, but the framing changes.
Exactly. So while the core tension between feeling agency and facing constraints might be a universal human concern, the specific ways it's understood and addressed are shaped by cultural and historical contexts.
And the debate itself has evolved.
Definitely. It's evolved alongside our intellectual understanding of the world, shifting from primarily theological and metaphysical frameworks, then incorporating classical physics, and now increasingly engaging with quantum mechanics and neuroscience. The framing has become progressively more secular and scientific over time, though the philosophical questions remain.
All right, so philosophy and history have provided this incredibly rich backdrop. Now let's bring in the scientists. How has science, particularly neuroscience, approached the question of free will?
Neuroscience has brought a whole new set of tools and perspectives.
Yeah.
It allows us to directly investigate the brain processes that underlie our decisions and actions. The central question is, how does our subjective experience of making a conscious choice relate to the objective activity we can measure in the brain?
And the famous experiments by Benjamin Libet are often brought up here, right? The finger movements.
Indeed. In the 1980s, Libet conducted experiments where participants performed simple, spontaneous finger movements, while their brain activity, EEG, was measured. They also had to report the moment they became consciously aware of their intention to move, using a clock.
Okay. And the finding?
The really surprising finding was the readiness potential, this gradual buildup of electrical activity in the brain's motor areas that began, on average, several hundred milliseconds before participants reported being consciously aware of their decision to move.
So the brain was getting ready to move before the person felt like they decided to move.
That's what it looked like.
Wow. That sounds like the brain makes the decision before I'm even consciously aware of making it. That's a pretty significant challenge to the idea of conscious free will being the initiator.
That was certainly a dominant initial interpretation. It led some to argue that our conscious will might be an illusion, or maybe just an afterthought, a late-stage observer rather than the prime mover of our actions. Our conscious feeling of deciding might just be the brain telling itself what it already started doing.
But these experiments have faced criticism.
Oh, numerous criticisms over the years, yes. For one, the tasks were very simple, arguably not representative of the complex, reasoned decisions we usually associate with free will, like choosing a job or a partner.
Right, just flicking a wrist.
Exactly. There are also questions about what the readiness potential actually reflects. Is it specifically a decision to move now, or maybe just general motor preparation, or rising background noise that sometimes crosses a threshold?
Okay.
And accurately pinpointing the exact moment of conscious intention using subjective reports and a clock face is inherently tricky and potentially inaccurate.
And didn't Libet himself have a different take later?
He did. Interestingly, Libet proposed the idea of a conscious veto. He suggested that even if we don't consciously initiate all actions the RPE starts before awareness, we might still have a small window of time, maybe 100, 200 milliseconds before the movement itself, to consciously stop the action.
Like an emergency brake.
Exactly. So maybe consciousness isn't the starting gun, but it could still be the final yes or no, the emergency brake. That was his attempt to preserve some role for conscious will.
That's an interesting twist. What has more recent neuroscience research revealed? Are we getting clearer answers?
Modern neuroscience is definitely employing more sophisticated techniques. fMRI, single neuron recording in patients undergoing surgery, TMS to stimulate or inhibit brain areas.
Okay.
Some studies using fMRI have shown it might be possible to predict simple choices, like pressing a left or right button, based on patterns of brain activity several seconds before the person reports being aware of that choice.
Seconds before. That sounds even more challenging.
It does, although the predictive accuracy is often only slightly above chance, and again, it's usually limited to very simple, often arbitrary decisions. It doesn't necessarily scale up to complex, meaningful choices.
Right.
Brain stimulation experiments are also fascinating. Directly activating certain brain regions can sometimes induce a feeling of intention or the urge to move in individuals, even if they didn't consciously decide to.
Wow.
Researchers are actively trying to identify specific neural markers that might differentiate between deliberate, reasoned decisions versus more automatic or arbitrary runs, and map the brain networks involved in things like planning, inhibition, and feeling agency.
So it's getting more detailed?
Much more detailed. Some contemporary theories even propose that our conscious experience of willing and action might actually be constructed by the brain after the initial neural processes have begun, perhaps as a way to create a coherent narrative of our actions.
So the feeling comes after the fact to explain what the brain did.
That's one influential line of thought, yes. So neuroscience is painting a far more intricate and perhaps less intuitively straightforward picture than a simple top-down model of conscious mind tells brain what to do.
It sounds like neuroscience is offering us these fascinating glimpses into the mechanics of decision-making, but it's not delivering a definitive yes or no answer to the philosophical question of free will itself. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair. It provides crucial data about the neural correlates of choice and volition, but the interpretation often depends on your underlying philosophical framework.
What about physics? We talked about determinism in classical physics. Does the weirdness of quantum mechanics offer any wiggle room for freedom?
The quantum mechanics question. It often comes up, largely because classical Newtonian physics presented such a clockwork, deterministic picture of the universe. If everything follows predictable laws, where's the freedom?
Right.
Quantum mechanics, developed in the early 20th century, introduced inherent uncertainty and probability at the subatomic level. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, for example, states there are fundamental limits to how precisely we can know certain pairs of properties, like a particle's position and momentum, simultaneously.
Okay.
And some quantum events, like radioactive decay or the path a particle takes in a double-slit experiment, seem to be genuinely probabilistic, not determined by prior conditions in a predictable way, only statistically predictable over many events.
So, if there's fundamental randomness down there at the smallest scales of reality, could our brains somehow harness that randomness to make truly free choices that aren't predetermined by the past?
It's a tempting idea for libertarians looking for a gap in determinism. If the base level of reality isn't strictly determined, maybe our choices aren't either.
But there's always a but.
There's a big but. The majority of scientists and philosophers remain pretty skeptical about this as a viable explanation for free will, for a few key reasons.
Okay, like what?
Well, the primary issue is that randomness isn't the same thing as control. If our choices were simply the direct result of random quantum fluctuations firing off neurons unpredictably,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be our choices in any meaningful, rational, responsible sense. They'd just be random events happening in our heads. How is a random choice more free or responsible than a determined one?
Good point. It just replaces determinism with randomness, not with control.
Exactly. There's no known mechanism by which we, our conscious selves, our intentions, could purposefully direct or influence this underlying quantum randomness to reliably produce a specific willed decision. How would the mind steer the quantum dice?
Right, the connection isn't clear at all.
And furthermore, many physicists and neuroscientists argue that these quantum effects, while real at the subatomic level, likely average out and become negligible at the macroscopic level of neurons and brain circuits. The brain operates in a warm, wet environment where quantum coherence is hard to maintain. So our neural activity might still be effectively deterministic for all practical purposes, even if the underlying physics isn't perfectly so.
So the quantum effects might just be noise that gets washed out.
That's a common view. And finally, it's important to remember that not all interpretations of quantum mechanics are even indeterministic. Some interpretations, like Bohmian mechanics or the many worlds interpretation, are perfectly deterministic, just in complex ways.
Oh, okay. So quantum mechanics isn't necessarily a get-out-of-jail-free card for determinism.
Not necessarily, no. So while quantum mechanics might challenge the strict, universal determinism of classical physics, its ability to provide a robust scientific basis for libertarian free will, the kind involving purposeful control over undetermined choices, remains highly speculative and controversial.
Okay, so quantum randomness probably isn't the magic key. What about just plain biology, genetics, and the environment we grow up in? These clearly have a huge impact on who we are and the choices we make.
Absolutely enormous impact. From a biological perspective, all of our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, including our decisions, are ultimately products of the physical processes occurring in our brains.
Brains are physical things.
Right, and our genes provide a foundational blueprint, influencing our temperament, predispositions, and so on. Then our environment, everything from prenatal conditions to upbringing, culture, life experiences, shapes our brain development, our personality, our biases, our desires.
Everything.
And ultimately, the range of choices we are likely to even consider, let alone make.
So some people argue this leaves no room for free will, like Sapolsky.
Exactly. Hard determinists or skeptics like Robert Sapolsky argue very forcefully that the cumulative effect of all these interacting biological and environmental factors leaves no genuine room for the kind of free will where you could have truly done otherwise. In his view, we are essentially the sum total of our biological and environmental luck, and our feeling of freedom is an illusion created by our ignorance of all the preceding causes.
That paints a pretty stark picture. We're just complex puppets of our genes and history. Is there any counter-argument to this strong biological determinism?
Yes, definitely. Many argue that while these factors are undeniable, powerful influences, they don't necessarily equate to rigid, inescapable determination of every single choice we make.
Oh, so?
They point to the incredible complexity and plasticity of the human brain, the role of higher-level cognitive processes like abstract reasoning, long-term planning, self-reflection.
Our ability to think about our options.
Right, and our apparent capacity for agency within those existing biological and environmental constraints. The ability to exercise self-control, for instance, to override immediate impulses or desires in favor of long-term goals or deeply held values, is often cited as evidence of this agency.
Like resisting a tempting dessert because you have a health goal.
Exactly. That feels like a form of freedom, of self-direction, even if the desire for the dessert and the health goal are themselves influenced by past factors. The crucial question remains whether this capacity for self-control and deliberation is itself ultimately determined, or if it reflects a degree of genuine, non-determined freedom. Compatibilists would say it can be determined and still count as free, while libertarians would insist it needs to be undetermined at some level.
The source also touches on the topic of animal minds. Do other animals have volition or make choices? How does that fit in?
That's a fascinating area. While traditional philosophical definitions of free will often emphasize uniquely human capacities like abstract self-awareness, complex symbolic reasoning, and moral judgment.
Yeah, we seem different.
It's pretty clear that many animals exhibit goal-directed behavior. They make choices to achieve those goals, finding food, mates, avoiding danger. Researchers studied decision-making processes even in insects or worms.
So maybe agency isn't all or nothing.
It suggests there might be a kind of continuum of agency across the animal kingdom, perhaps varying in complexity and flexibility.
What makes human free will potentially different then, if it is different?
What likely distinguishes human free will, if it exists in a unique way, are those more complex cognitive capacities we just mentioned. Our ability to reflect on our values and long-term goals, engage in intricate planning spanning years, use language to reason about abstract possibilities and counterfactuals, and perhaps most crucially, make moral judgments about right and wrong and hold ourselves and others responsible based on those judgments.
So is it a difference in degree, just more complex agency, or a fundamental difference in kind?
That's the million-dollar question, really. Are we just much more sophisticated biological machines making complex choices, or is there something fundamentally different about our capacity for conscious, reasoned, morally significant choice? The jury is still very much out on that.
It sounds like science is offering us increasingly detailed insights into the mechanisms underlying choice and behavior, but the interpretation of these findings in relation to the big philosophical concept of free will remains really complex and debated.
Precisely. And it's crucial to be aware of how interpretation works here. The way we interpret scientific findings, like the Libet results, is often heavily influenced by our pre-existing philosophical assumptions about what free will is or requires.
So a compatibilist might see Libet differently than an incompatibilist.
Absolutely. A compatibilist might say, okay, so conscious awareness comes a bit late, but the action still originated from the person's brain, reflecting their dispositions that's compatible with my view of freedom. An incompatibilist might say, see, conscious will isn't the initiator, so no libertarian free will.
Right. The data doesn't speak for itself entirely.
Not on this issue, no. There's still a significant explanatory gap between our understanding of micro-level brain activity, neurons firing, quantum effects maybe, and our macro-level subjective experience of making conscious choices and feeling in control.
Bridging that gap is hard.
Very hard. And it's crucial to avoid conflating concepts. Predictability isn't necessarily the same as determinism. Complex systems can be deterministic but unpredictable. And causation doesn't automatically mean passivity or lack of agency. Compatibilists emphasize that our determined decisions can still be the result of active deliberation reflecting our internal states. Clear definitions are key.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. Now let's turn to the real-world implications. The source discusses the weight of choice. How does this whole free will debate impact our understanding of morality and our legal systems? Because that seems huge.
This is where the rubber really hits the road, because the intuitive link between free will and moral responsibility is so incredibly deeply ingrained in our thinking and social practices.
We blame people. We praise people.
Exactly. If free will, especially in that robust libertarian sense of could have done otherwise, turns out to be an illusion, it seems to undermine the very foundation of our traditional ideas about who deserves praise or blame for their actions. If people couldn't have genuinely done otherwise, the basis for moral desert, the idea that they fundamentally deserve certain treatment based on their actions, appears to crumble.
So if someone commits a harmful act and they didn't really have a free choice in the matter because their actions were determined by factors ultimately beyond their control, does that mean they shouldn't be held morally responsible or legally accountable?
That's the really challenging question that hard determinists and free will skeptics force us to confront. Some argue, yes, if we accept determinism, our focus should shift away from punishment based purely on blame and retribution. They deserve to suffer.
What should it shift to?
Instead, perhaps we should concentrate on consequentialist justifications for how we respond, things like protecting society from further harm, deterring future harmful behavior in them or others, and attempting to rehabilitate offenders or modify the factors that led to the behavior, more like treating a dangerous condition than punishing a sin.
But what about the compatibilists? They think free will and determinism work together.
Right. Compatibilists maintain that their conception of free will acting voluntarily, according to your reasons, without coercion, perhaps with certain rational capacities intact, is sufficient to ground a meaningful form of moral responsibility and legal accountability, even in a deterministic world. They'd say the person who acts from their own malicious desires is responsible, even if those desires were ultimately determined.
What about our legal system as it currently exists? It seems fundamentally based on the idea that people are responsible for their choices, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Legal systems pretty much everywhere operate on the assumption of free will, at least in some practical sense. Foundational concepts like mens rea, the guilty mind, or criminal intent rely on the idea that the person chose to act wrongfully.
And punishment.
Especially retributive punishment. The idea that wrongdoers deserve to suffer proportionally for their freely chosen actions is often explicitly justified by this belief in free choice. If libertarian free will is indeed an illusion, this justification becomes deeply problematic.
So are people suggesting legal reforms based on this?
Yes. As the source mentions, some legal scholars and thinkers influenced by neuroscience and skepticism, like Joshua Green alongside Sapolsky, are beginning to consider potential reforms. These might move the system away from retribution and towards a more preventative, rehabilitative, and behavior management-focused approach, looking more at future risk than past blame.
But could the current system survive a rejection of libertarian free will?
That's the counter-argument. Many argue that our existing legal practices, in reality, often rely implicitly on a more compatibilist understanding of freedom. Was the action voluntary, not forced? Was it intentional? Did the person understand the nature and consequences of their actions? Did they have the capacity for rational control?
Like legal defenses.
Exactly. Legal defenses like insanity, duress, or extreme provocation often work by negating precisely these conditions, showing the person lacked voluntariness, intent, or rational capacity. So it's possible that our current legal framework, which already focuses on these capacities, could largely be upheld, perhaps with some adjustments like less emphasis on pure retribution, even if we adopt a more nuanced or even compatibilist understanding of free will.
It's not just about our institutions, though, is it? Our personal beliefs about free will must have some kind of impact on our own psychology and how we live our lives.
Oh, indeed they do. There's a growing body of research in psychology looking at exactly this.
And what does it suggest?
It suggests that when people's belief in free will is experimentally weakened or undermined, say by reading deterministic arguments, it can have a range of somewhat concerning behavioral consequences.
Like what?
Things like an increase in cheating, a decrease in helpfulness towards others, potentially even links to increased aggression, lower feelings of gratitude, and maybe a diminished sense of meaning in life. Though it's important to say this is a complex and still actively researched area with some debate about the robustness and interpretation of findings.
So disbelief might make people feel less accountable.
That seems to be the implication in some studies. Conversely, a strong belief in free will is often associated with positive outcomes, things like better job performance, greater academic achievement, more willingness to learn from mistakes, stronger feelings of self-efficacy.
Why would that be?
Well, the belief in free will aligns powerfully with our intuitive sense of agency and control. Believing you can make choices and influence outcomes seems crucial for motivation, effort, and self-regulation. Denying free will can feel, perhaps subconsciously, like a license for irresponsibility or apathy. If it's all determined anyway, why bother trying? Our belief in free will seems to play a really crucial role in how we navigate our social interactions and strive towards goals.
So even if the ultimate philosophical or scientific verdict is still out, the belief in free will seems to have tangible real-world effects on how we behave and maybe even how society functions.
It certainly seems to.
What are the broader existential implications of all this, then? How do we live with or without a firm belief in free will? Does it change everything?
That's a deeply personal and profound question, isn't it? If we really come to believe deep down that free will is an illusion, it could significantly impact our sense of self, our identity.
Who am I, if not the free chooser?
Exactly. Our understanding of purpose and meaning in life, maybe even our capacity for things we deeply value, like love, creativity, moral striving, which are often linked to our sense of agency and making meaningful choices.
So what do the skeptics say we should do? Just accept it?
Those who advocate for free will skepticism, like Sapolsky or Dirk Pereboom, argue that yes, we should embrace this understanding. They suggest it could foster greater empathy and compassion towards others, recognizing that their actions, like our own, are ultimately shaped by factors beyond their ultimate control. Less blame, more understanding.
Can we still find meaning?
They argue that meaning and purpose can still be found in relationships, experiences, contributing to well-being, just without the illusion of ultimate authorship or desert.
And the compatibilists?
Compatibilists, on the other hand, argue that we don't need to abandon the concept of free will or its importance. We just need to understand it correctly, in a way that aligns with a potentially deterministic reality, focusing on rational control, authenticity, reason's responsiveness. They'd say our sense of meaning and responsibility remains intact.
But there are worries if belief in free will fades generally.
Yes, there are genuine worries, often expressed, about the potential for nihilism, apathy, or even social breakdown. It's a widespread belief in agency and responsibility is significantly eroded. How would society function if no one truly believed anyone was responsible? It's speculative, but it highlights the perceived stakes.
It sounds like whether we ultimately conclude that we have robust free will or not, just grappling with this question forces us to confront some very fundamental ideas about who we are, why we do what we do, and how the world operates.
Precisely. Our beliefs about free will, explicit or implicit, have real consequences for our behavior, our emotions, and the very fabric of our societies and institutions, like the justice system. This entire debate forces us really to critically examine our deepest intuitions about agency, choice, and moral evaluation.
And neither path seems easy.
Not really. Accepting a skeptical view of free will requires a pretty radical revision of our common sense understanding of ourselves and others. But embracing compatibilism often demands that we adjust our intuitive, perhaps libertarian-leaning understanding of what free will truly means, letting go of the could have done otherwise in the exact same circumstances idea. Either way, it has the potential for a transformative impact on how we perceive ourselves and our place in the moral landscape.
The source also delves into some specific nuances and queries. One mentioned was the idea of cold-hearted free will. That's not a standard term, is it? What might that signify in this discussion?
No, it's not a standard philosophical term. So it could be interpreted a few ways depending on context.
Let's guess.
It might refer to the capacity for making choices based purely on cold, unemotional rationality, perhaps detached from empathy or moral concern. Think of a calculating strategic choice that ignores feelings. Or it could perhaps refer to making a morally callous or cruel choice, exercising one's will in a way that deliberately harms others without remorse, a cold-hearted use of one's freedom.
Or maybe something else.
Possibly. It could even be used, maybe critically, to describe a mechanistic or deterministic view of the will itself, suggesting our choices are just the cold, predetermined output of impersonal causal processes, lacking genuine warmth or personal spirit. Different philosophical stances would analyze such a concept through their own lenses, focusing on the role of reason, emotion, moral intent, or the underlying causal nature of the choice.
And what about the seemingly paradoxical notion raised in the source, choosing to make free will? That sounds circular.
It does sound contradictory on the surface, yeah. Free will is generally considered a capacity one possesses, or doesn't, which then allows one to make choices. You don't typically choose to have the capacity itself in the moment you exercise it.
So how might we interpret that phrase?
Well, it might be used metaphorically, perhaps, to refer to the developmental process of achieving greater autonomy and self-control over time. Through conscious effort, reflection, therapy, or practice, one might arguably build or strengthen their capacity for a reasoned choice, in a sense, choosing to become freer over the long term.
Like developing a skill.
Kind of. Or it could potentially relate to William James's pragmatic idea we touched on, that believing in free will can be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, a performative act that shapes our experience and perhaps even our capabilities. Acting as if you were free might, in some sense, contribute to being freer. But from a strict philosophical standpoint, the capacity for choice typically has to precede the act of choosing itself. So choosing to make free will remains a potentially confusing or conceptually misapplied phrase.
The complex relationship between free will, time, and the possibility of foreknowledge keeps surfacing. Why is that connection so significant in this debate?
It's incredibly significant because determinism, at its core, seems to imply a fixed future. If every event is causally necessitated by prior events plus the laws of nature, then the entire future course of the universe, including all our actions, is in principle already set or determined by the past.
So no open future.
Exactly. This directly challenges the intuitive idea that our choices are genuinely open, that we create the future through our decisions. If the future is already fixed, how can our choices be truly free in the sense of selecting among genuinely available alternatives?
And that's where foreknowledge comes in.
Right. The theological problem of divine foreknowledge is a classic illustration of this tension. If an omniscient God infallibly knows what you will do tomorrow, it seems logically necessary that you will do that thing, making it apparently impossible for you to do otherwise.
Even if God doesn't cause it.
Even if God doesn't cause it, the argument goes, the infallible foreknowledge itself implies the future event is fixed. And similar issues arise in purely secular contexts with the philosophical concept of logical fatalism. That explores questions about whether statements about future contingent events, like you will have coffee tomorrow, already have a definite truth value, true or false. Now, if they do, does that mean the future is already fixed, regardless of determinism?
Wow, that's mind-bending.
It is. These issues highlight how our fundamental understanding of time, is it linear, branching, fixed, Truth, does truth apply to the future? And knowledge, can the future be known, deeply intersects with the possibility of the kind of open future that many people believe is essential for genuine free will.
Finally, the source mentions the role of logic and maybe calculations in the free will debate. It's not like philosophers are sitting there with calculators doing mathematical equations about free will, are they?
No, not in the traditional mathematical sense generally. But the free will debate is heavily reliant on logic and rigorous argumentation.
In what way?
Philosophers construct and evaluate formal logical arguments, like the consequence argument we discussed, which has premises and a conclusion and aims for deductive validity. They spend a lot of time on careful conceptual analysis, meticulously defining key terms like freedom, control, determinism, possibility, causation, because ambiguity can wreck an argument.
Making sure everyone means the same thing.
Exactly. And assessing the logical consistency of different philosophical positions, do the parts of libertarianism or compatibilism hold together without contradiction? Even when considering the implications of probability and quantum physics, philosophers engage in careful logical interpretation of what those probabilities mean for determinism and control. So while you won't typically find numerical calculations, the debate is very much driven by the principles of sound reasoning, logical structure, and deductive inference. Precision in argument is paramount.
This has been an incredibly deep and multifaceted exploration. Seriously fascinating stuff. So as we begin to sort of wrap up here, what are the key insights or takeaways that you'd really want our listeners to hold on to from this deep dive into free will?
I think the most important takeaway is probably the sheer complexity and, frankly, the unresolved nature of this enduring question. There's just no easy answers here.
Definitely not.
And the debate has engaged brilliant minds across centuries and multiple fields of inquiry for a reason. We've seen that fundamental tension between our powerful intuitive sense of freedom and the challenging implications of determinism, whether it's classical or arising from biology.
Right.
We've explored the diverse range of philosophical positions, trying to reconcile or resolve this tension, from the stark choices offered by libertarianism and hard determinism to the various attempts by compatibilism to find a way for freedom and determinism to coexist.
And the science.
And we've seen the fascinating, albeit sometimes ambiguous or challenging, contributions from neuroscience, physics, and biology, providing data about mechanisms, but not necessarily settling the philosophical debate.
And finally, the impact.
And crucially, we've touched upon the profound implications this debate has for our understanding of morality, law, personal responsibility, our beliefs about ourselves, and maybe even our sense of meaning in life. It really matters.
It certainly feels like we've maybe only just scratched the surface of a truly vast and intricate topic, but hopefully we've provided you listening with a solid framework, a map maybe, for understanding the major arguments and the key players in this ongoing and often quite heated discussion.
Absolutely. It remains a very active and deeply fascinating area of inquiry across disciplines. While determinism, in its various forms, presents a significant challenge to certain popular conceptions of free will, the possibilities raised by indeterminacy, even if challenging to harness for control, and the persistent arguments of compatibilists continue to offer alternative perspectives.
It's not over yet.
Not by a long shot. Ultimately, the importance of this inquiry, I think, lies in its potential to profoundly shape our understanding of what it means to be human, to be an agent acting in a world governed by causes, and how we ought to live together.
So a final thought for you to consider, perhaps. Considering all the complexities we've explored today, the philosophy, the science, the implications, what single aspect of free will do you find the most compelling, or perhaps the most difficult, to reconcile with your own lived experience of making choices every day?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder.
It's definitely a question that continues to provoke thought and fuel debate. We encourage you to keep mulling over these ideas and perhaps consider how your own implicit beliefs about free will, whatever they are, might influence your actions and the way you view the world around you. This has been a truly mind-bending journey into the heart of human agency and decision-making.
This is DigitView.